On the night of April 21st, the most powerful military force on Earth executed an operation in pitch-black water that no government anticipated, no intelligence service publicly predicted, and no navy on the planet could have prevented. Within 72 hours, the United States fundamentally severed the single most critical energy artery connecting two of its greatest strategic rivals, and it did so not from a negotiating table or a press podium, but from the deck of a sanctioned oil tanker in the middle of the Indian Ocean, with ropes, boots, and the most elite soldiers alive. What followed was not a diplomatic protest. It was the sound of a global order being rewritten in real time, and the nation that should have responded with force could do nothing but watch. Understand the gravity of what is unfolding by subscribing to John Doland Reports Now and staying for the full analysis, because this story changes everything. To grasp the magnitude of what just occurred, you must first understand a dependency so deep and so deliberately obscured that most people have never heard it described with any honesty. China's industrial economy, the largest manufacturing apparatus in human history, runs on oil. Not metaphorically, literally. The factories, the refineries, the petrochemical plants, the supply chains that feed half the consumer products on Earth all depend on a constant, uninterrupted flow of crude. And for years, a staggering proportion of that crude has come from one source, Iran. The relationship between Beijing and Tehran has never been loud or glamorous. It has been quiet, methodical, and enormously profitable for both parties. China receives heavily discounted oil, often purchased far below market value, routed through intermediaries and shell companies designed to circumvent international sanctions. Iran receives the cash flow that keeps its government solvent and its economy from outright disintegration. According to analysis published by Reuters and corroborated by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports were flowing directly to China. That is not a trade relationship. That is a structural dependency so absolute that severing it does not merely inconvenience either party. It threatens the foundational stability of both economies. And the entirety of this arrangement passed through one geographic choke point that both nations assumed would remain permanently beyond American reach: the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow corridor between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, just over 20 miles wide at its tightest point, is one of the most strategically critical waterways on the planet. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has long reported that nearly a third of all seaborne oil transits this passage on any given day. For China, the strait is not merely important. It is existential. Beijing understood for years that if Hormuz ever became compromised, the consequences for its industrial machine would be catastrophic. So Chinese strategists monitored it obsessively. They cultivated relationships across the Gulf states. They diversified supply routes where feasible. And they quietly assembled what Western intelligence agencies came to call the Shadow Fleet, a sprawling network of ghost tankers operating under falsified identities, cycling through flags of convenience, disabling transponders, and exploiting every loophole in the maritime regulatory system to move Iranian crude beneath American surveillance. For a time, as the Wall Street Journal documented across multiple investigative reports, the system functioned effectively. Hundreds of millions of barrels transited this shadow network with minimal detection. But what happened in the waters off South Asia proved definitively that those days are finished. On the night of April 21st, somewhere between Sri Lanka and Indonesia, in the Bay of Bengal, a massive tanker designated the MT Tiffany was moving through open water, running completely dark. No transponder signal, no declared cargo, no identifiable flag. Her hull carried approximately 1.9 million barrels of crude oil loaded at Iran's Karg Island terminal, and her heading pointed directly toward the Chinese mainland. The vessel was part of the Shadow Fleet, one of dozens of sanctioned ships notorious for cycling through fabricated registrations. Her captain believed he had threaded the most dangerous stretch of the journey. He had cleared the Persian Gulf, transited the most surveilled waters on Earth, and reached open ocean. He believed he was safe. He was catastrophically wronged. Without warning, helicopters materialized from the darkness above the ship's deck. Fast ropes deployed. Within seconds, United States Navy SEALs were aboard. No shots were fired. No resistance materialized. The entire operation concluded before the crew fully comprehended what was happening. The USS Lewis B. Puller, an expeditionary sea base purpose-built for operations of exactly this nature, had served as the launch platform. As CBS News and multiple international outlets confirmed within hours, the Pentagon released footage deliberately calibrated for maximum strategic communication. American operators in full tactical gear moving across the deck of a sanctioned Iranian oil tanker in international waters at 0:30. The message required no translation. There is no route beyond our reach. There is no shadow dark enough. But what elevated this from a dramatic single incident into something far more consequential was the pattern it established. Just 48 hours before the Tiffany was seized, the United States had already intercepted another vessel, the Tusca, under nearly identical circumstances. 2 ships in 2 days, both carrying Iranian crude, both bound for China. As CNBC reported at the time, this was not coincidence. This was a coordinated campaign of interdiction. And while the Shadow Fleet was being systematically hunted across the Indian Ocean, something even more destabilizing was occurring at the entrance to the Strait of Hormuz itself. Iran turned away a Chinese ship. A vessel identified as the Sun Prophet was approaching the strait when Iranian authorities denied it passage. The ship executed a sharp reversal and withdrew entirely. Then came the statement from Iranian consular channels that stunned every analyst monitoring the situation. Iran does not grant blanket approval to all Chinese vessels. Passage through the Strait of Hormuz is not guaranteed to any party. Tehran, the government that had publicly positioned Beijing as its most vital strategic partner, its economic lifeline through a decade of crushing sanctions, had just blocked a Chinese vessel from entering its own waters. Whether this represented a deliberate strategic recalibration or simply the consequence of the overwhelming pressure Iran was absorbing, the practical effect was identical. Beijing was being squeezed from both directions simultaneously. The United States was hunting its tankers in open ocean. Iran was restricting its access at the source. The one corridor sustaining this entire energy architecture was becoming something neither government could control. The American naval presence surrounding Hormuz at this moment is not merely significant. It is historically overwhelming. According to reporting from ABC News and Department of Defense briefings, more than 15 warships and over 10,000 active military personnel are operating in a combat architecture that functions simultaneously above, across, and beneath the ocean surface. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group leads the formation. Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers provide overlapping radar coverage and offensive capability. FA-18 Super Hornets fly continuous patrols. P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft scan the surface in real time. MQ-4C Triton drones at extreme altitude feed continuous vessel identification data to American command. This is not a blockade in the formal legal sense. But what the United States has assembled is something more suffocating. It is a surveillance and deterrence net so total that attempting to transit without authorization has become functionally suicidal. Chinese tankers approaching the strait have been met with cold, precise radio warnings from American destroyer crews. The message is clinical. Turn around. You will not pass. And they turn around. The Rich Starry, a massive tanker linked to a Shanghai-based shipping company carrying nearly 250,000 barrels of Iran-linked cargo, attempted to navigate around the cordon by running silent along the UAE coast under cover of darkness. For a brief window, the tactic appeared to succeed. The vessel entered the Gulf of Oman. Then the USS Spruance appeared. The destroyer had been tracking her the entire time. The warning transmitted left no room for interpretation. The rich Starry reversed course within minutes. She was not alone. The Merlkin, the Peace Gulf, and several other China-linked tankers each attempted passage. Different routes, different timings, different strategies. Every single one was turned back. The American military had not left a single gap. Share this analysis now with someone who needs to understand what is actually reshaping the global order. I am John Doland. This is John Doland Reports, and we dismantle the narratives that governments construct to expose the forces that truly move the world. Subscribe, hit the like button, and leave your strategic assessment in the comments, because the second half of this story is even more consequential than the first. Examine what has happened to Karg Island. This port facility in the northern Persian Gulf handles roughly 90% of all Iranian oil exports. For years, it operated continuously. Tankers queued at its berths around the clock. The revenue it generated was not merely economically significant. It was the financial oxygen sustaining the Iranian state. Today, according to tanker tracking data published by Reuters and satellite imagery analyzed by multiple open-source intelligence groups, Karg Island has gone silent. Pipelines behind them are under dangerous pressure because the oil has nowhere to flow. Chabahar, Bandar Abbas, Asaluye, Larak Island, every major node in Iran's export infrastructure has ground to a halt. The economic hemorrhage is devastating. Every day this continues, Tehran loses millions in revenue that funds government operations, military expenditures, and the fragile architecture of domestic stability. On the Chinese side, the consequences are cascading with alarming speed. The independent teapot refineries that account for a significant share of China's total processing capacity are confronting rising procurement costs and rapidly shrinking supply options. These facilities were built around cheap Iranian crude. That crude is no longer accessible. As the Wall Street Journal's energy desk has reported, finding a replacement at comparable price and scale is not a problem that resolves quickly. So how did Beijing respond to having its most critical energy artery severed by the most powerful navy on Earth? It went to the microphone. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs called the blockade dangerous and irresponsible. The Ministry of National Defense issued declarations that China's energy agreements must not be subjected to unilateral interference. Strong words, carefully calibrated outrage, and then nothing happened militarily. Nothing at all. China's naval presence in the Middle East consists of a limited contingent at its base in Djibouti, a handful of frigates, some logistical vessels, a footprint built for peacetime operations, not for confronting America's most lethal carrier strike group. Deploying those assets toward Hormuz would constitute a catastrophe, and Beijing knew it. What the world is witnessing is the most consequential revelation of China's military limitations outside its immediate geographic sphere. The theoretical power of an enormous standing army means functionally nothing when the conflict occurs 10,000 kilometers away in waters your navy cannot contest. While Beijing drew down strategic petroleum reserves at accelerating rates to keep factories running, something remarkable was happening on the opposite side of the planet. American ports erupted with activity. The Gulf Coast energy infrastructure, stretching across Texas and Louisiana, entered a period of historic abundance. As Iranian oil vanished from global markets, a vacuum formed. Prices climbed. Buyers scrambled to replace enormous volumes. They turned to the only nation capable of filling the void at scale. According to Bloomberg shipping data and the Port of Houston Authority, more than 70 very large crude carriers scheduled entries into American ports during April alone. Houston, Corpus Christi, Port Fourchon, every terminal shifted to around-the-clock operations. Washington was simultaneously executing two objectives with a single campaign: crippling China's energy access while generating billions in additional American oil revenue. But the most quietly devastating dimension of this story belongs to Moscow. When the blockade began, the logical expectation was that Russia would support its ally. Moscow and Tehran have publicly aligned on multiple fronts. Both operate under American sanctions. Both cultivate a shared narrative of resistance. So when Iran's economy began hemorrhaging, where was Russia? Watching, counting, profiting. The global oil price spike was not a problem for the Kremlin. It was a windfall. According to estimates compiled by the Financial Times and energy analysts cited by CNBC, Russia's oil revenues effectively doubled within a single month. Moscow quietly secured an estimated $19 billion in additional income directly attributable to the Persian Gulf crisis. Simultaneously, China, desperate for alternatives, began purchasing Russian crude at accelerated rates under terms increasingly favorable to Moscow, because Beijing had neither leverage nor options. Putin had not fired a shot, deployed a vessel, or made a single provocative move. He had allowed his ostensible ally to drown, collected the profits, and locked in a long-term energy dependence with the world's second-largest economy. The Kremlin issued statements condemning the blockade, expressed concern, endorsed open waterways, and never sent so much as a Coast Guard cutter toward Hormuz. This is what the cold mathematics of geopolitics looks like beneath official statements. There are no permanent friendships. There are interests. And the nation that calculates its interests most ruthlessly is invariably the one that emerges ahead. The full picture is now visible. The United States constructed a trap built over years of sanctions, naval expansion, and intelligence development. When the moment arrived, Washington closed it with surgical precision. Iran discovered that no bilateral partnership insulates a nation from military geography. The Strait of Hormuz, which Tehran long considered its own strategic lever, became the mechanism of its strangulation. China watched its energy architecture disintegrate in weeks. Its shadow fleet hunted, its tankers turned back, its refineries starved, and its military unable to respond because the contest was occurring in a theater where Chinese power does not reach. Russia walked away with billions and a deepened Chinese dependency that will shape Eurasian power dynamics for years. American oil flowed into the vacuum at record volume and record price. Every actor behaved according to the logic of its own interests, and the nation controlling the ocean controlled the outcome. There is a principle repeated across centuries. Whoever commands the seas commands the world. What just occurred across the Strait of Hormuz, the Bay of Bengal, and the ports of the American Gulf Coast constitutes a brutal contemporary proof of that ancient truth. The nation that can project force into any ocean, interdict shipments on the far side of the planet in darkness, and transform a vital trade corridor into a dead end without firing an offensive weapon does not merely win individual confrontations. It writes the rules by which all confrontations are resolved. Beijing is drawing down reserves at accelerating rates, renegotiating contracts under unfavorable terms, and watching industrial output soften as costs climb. It is doing everything except the one thing that would change the equation: projecting meaningful naval force into waters under total American dominance. That option does not exist for China today. And every day the blockade holds, the cost of that strategic gap becomes more starkly apparent. The warships keeping the oil from moving are flying the stars and stripes. The world has witnessed the most consequential demonstration of maritime power since the Cold War, and it is far from over. The decisions made in the coming weeks will determine whether this was an incident or a turning point, whether the era of shadow fleets is ending, and whether the global order is being renegotiated not in conference rooms, but in the dark waters of the open ocean. One thing is already undeniable: the nation that controls the sea lanes controls the future. And right now, that nation is the United States. The only question remaining is what China does next. That answer will reshape the balance of global power, and you need to be here when it unfolds. I am John Doland, and this is John Doland Reports. If this analysis revealed what is truly happening beneath the surface of world events, subscribe to this channel immediately. Hit the like button, share this video with anyone who needs to understand where global power is actually heading, and leave your assessment in the comments. What will China's next move be? The conversation continues here.